senior investigative reporter and producer for Reveal News, Aura Bogado. She has been working on the immigration beat for years now. Aura, welcome to the program. I'm here with Emma Vigeland. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's just start with the way that what's going on at the border, I guess, and really, I mean, dealing with the warehousing of these children at the border, how it's being portrayed in the media, how it's being referred to. There's almost these two competing narratives. One is there's this narrative of like there's a so-called surge at the border, and this is creating a crisis for the country. And then there's other people who are saying there's a humanitarian crisis, at the border because we're warehousing children who, we're warehousing them just period, but we're doing so contrary to the laws of this country in terms of how we're supposed to be treating these kids. What is your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, it is a humanitarian crisis. Anytime that you are, as you say, warehousing children or any humans for any sustained period of time, that is a humanitarian crisis. You can think about anything from sanitary issues to the potential for abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse in these kinds of facilities is high. This idea that it is a crisis, like it came out of nowhere, it's a kind of almost like a natural phenomena is, I think, how I perceive a lot of the kind of framing around this. It was completely expected under this new administration. We had moments when this happened in the prior administration. There are very real reasons for why people, including children, want to come here. It often is rooted in violence and a whole bunch of other things that I hope that we can get to in this segment. But this idea that it is like somehow a surprise, it's not a surprise. I know that I can tell you from our immigration, our small immigration team. I work with my great colleague Laura C. Morel, and we've known that this is coming. So it's not a surprise. It is an increased number. And it's an increased number that this administration should have been prepared for, given that they campaigned a lot around immigration. It was a talking point.
All right, so let's go through and let's just for a moment reserve, put aside, but we will get to the sort of things that drive people from their countries and discuss that in the context of Vice President Harris, who's just been tasked with sort of supposedly dealing with those issues in those countries. But aside from that for a moment, and we will get to that, what were the sort of like mechanical things, if you will, that you guys were aware of that surely the incoming Biden administration would have been aware of, that have led to the issues that we have today?
So do you mean in terms of like what the administration should have been prepared for once children were already here?
Yeah, well, that, and you just said that there were signs and clearly ways for the administration to predict. What were those signs? What are those things that what forces are working that would have been predictable for the administration?
Right. So the political forces are this broad understanding, not only in Central America, but throughout the world, that Trump was really tough on immigration. He and his administration instituted the zero tolerance policy, which resulted in the separation of children from their families. That is unique to that administration. That hadn't been done in a massive scale like that ever before. It's unlikely that it would happen again, although it could. And so the idea that this person was leaving office and Biden was then going to come in, that alone is going to make people think that it may be easier to come at this time. It makes coyotes think that it may be, well, I don't know exactly what they may or may not think, but they can certainly spread that idea around. It's also spring. We see, there are times when people are more likely to cross than others. It's sometimes more difficult during some times of some points in winter, and the pandemic is starting to let up. You're seeing that communities, countries, whatever it is, different locales are starting to open up more. So those are kind of three more sort of political factors that I think had to do with the way that people perceive being able to come at this time. But remember too that even after zero tolerance and family separation, a couple of years ago in 2019, we saw a lot of people come as well. I mean, there are times when people come to the border for very real reasons.
And we should say, I think in 2019, at least as of like a week or two ago, the perception was that there was actually more people coming at that time. And I also just want to say, in terms of the coyotes, like you said, you can't, know what they're thinking. But as a pure sales proposition, if you're a coyote, arguing Joe Biden's going to be easier than Donald Trump, however you want to phrase that, Joe Biden's more humane. There's going to be more opportunities for you there. That's a sales pitch that coyotes would have. So what should have the Biden administration done? And, we're 2 months into the Biden administration, maybe 65 days at this point, maybe a little less, into the Biden administration. What should they have done in anticipation for these numbers, which were obviously like reasonably anticipated?
Right. So the sort of trajectory for most kids who are asking for asylum once they reach the border is that they're temporarily put in a border facility, and then from there go into a different agency. It's called the Office of Refugee Resettlement. It's under the Department of Health and Human Services. And those are the shelters that we've heard a lot about. The administration is saying that, there is a large number of children coming. There aren't enough shelters. It's still a pandemic. There's still a public health crisis. And so for that reason, children are languishing at these border facilities for a lot longer. Those shelters exist. They've had grants for a really long time. They've had time to get ready. Biden thought that he might win, because otherwise, why would he have ever run? And then in November, he was elected. So at that time, in that kind of 2-month stretch, the administration could have done more in order to prepare these shelters to be ready and to take care of children in that kind of another middle step before they're reunified with a family member or a sponsor. And I think that that's what didn't happen. I think that's why we're seeing these sort of pop-up tent facilities. The most recent one that's, I believe, about to open is in San Diego, the San Diego Convention Center, I believe. So we're seeing, these big kind of warehouses, places that are more suited for maybe military barracks or sporting events than housing a lot of children. And again, when you have a lot of children together, especially kids who are often fleeing trauma, there's a lot of risk involved with that, versus in smaller shelters, which come with their own risks. I don't want to minimize, some of the abuse and trauma that happens there. But it's different than being in this much bigger, huge tent place.
What is, so once they go to the ORR and places them in these shelters, what's the turnaround time? Like, I mean, the idea is that they're going to be contacting the administrators at these shelters are going to be interviewing the kids. The kids say, my cousin lives here, my uncle lives here, my aunt lives here, my dad, my mom, my brother, my sister. And the ORR people try and connect. Is that basically the way the process works?
That's essentially how it works. There's a lot of kind of contracting and subcontracting, but there's a group of people who are tasked with reuniting a child with a sponsor. It generally isn't somebody that they were separated from at the border, but sometimes it is, because unless you are a child who is entering with your biological parent or a guardian, as defined very strictly by that Border Patrol officer, you're going to be reunited a lot of times with someone who's already here. That may be your parent, that may be, as you said, a cousin. That time is indefinite. It's supposed to be quick. The rules are that you want to do a reunification as soon as possible. And you want to vet the sponsor and make sure that it's a suitable place, et cetera. But I know from my own reporting that there are children that spend an incredibly long amount of time. The last story that I investigated, this was a kid who was separated from her aunt and another cousin at the border when she was 10 years old. When Biden was vice president, actually, so this happened under Obama in 2013, she then spent 10 to 17 just going from shelter to shelter to shelter to shelter. She started to think that her family had abandoned her. They had not. I found that her family was right here in the United States, in North Carolina. However, before I was able to give her the message that was the case, she asked to be deported back to Honduras. So this child spent from age 10 to 17 just bouncing around shelters, is more well-traveled than most 10 to 17-year-olds that I know. I mean, she was from Washington to Massachusetts to Texas to New York, back to Texas, back to, she was sort of all over the place. And during that time, it's remarkable that she did not learn English. She knows some English. I mean, I still am, in touch with her. She has some phrases. She knows yes or no, but she did not really learn English. And as someone who came here as a child, I mean, that's like the prime time when you learn English. It's a lot easier to learn a new language during that time. She didn't really learn how to read or write. She doesn't really have a full sense of the world. She was like in the United States, but pretty much always a captive to this agency, and now has been deported in the middle of a pandemic back to Honduras. So where she also didn't gain the skills. Think about all of the kind of social cues that you learn from 10 to 17. You don't learn those in a shelter. You're not even allowed a hug in a shelter. So she's told me like she never got a hug for that entire time. So just imagine trying to, then suddenly be an adult. She's about to be, 18 at the end of the year. And that was her life. And so we see that it's rare, but some kids do spend a lot of time. We found that at least close to 1,000 kids have spent a year or longer in these shelters. And that's, again, it's just a really, really, really big part of your life. A year now, think about the last year in this pandemic, a lot of us have, not been able to leave the house. So think about just being locked up in a shelter, not having a hug, having some form of education, but it's kind of this recycled program where you learn the ABCs, 3, 4, 5 times in a year, and then it's just recycled over and over again. So, for the most part, we see that a lot of kids are released to a sponsor in a reasonable amount of time. But then we do know that there's a sliver of kids that just stay in there indefinitely. They always get out when they're 18, then they go to adult detention.
That story is just so devastating. How does that happen? I mean, how like where was the breakdown in that situation? And just broadly speaking, is this just a question of ultimately like we just don't want to expend the resources, like that this could be done better, but we just don't. It's just not important enough for us as a country to expend the resources on this?
I do think that there is a will, there is a good intention. People that work within this agency and broadly within DHHS have social work backgrounds. They come in with very good intentions. They think of DHS as sort of the cops, the enforcers, and they're the sort of social workers, right? So I don't think that it's that necessarily, but I do think that there's a lot of ineptness that I've seen. And it can be just on the side of like 1 or 2 people that are tasked with really important things like reunifying a family, right? I've also seen, anecdotally, more and more what we've seen in our reporting, in our investigations, is that kids come in, they're very excited to be here. They've finally made it here. It usually is a pretty hard journey just to even get here. And they're pretty motivated that first like week or two. They're going to do their ABCs. They've got a bed. They feel, relative safety. They may finally be in touch with a family member that they want to reunite with. The motivation to sort of be a good kid during that time really starts to turn. I would say anecdotally, again, between 2 and 4 weeks, kids start to feel like, wait a second, am I going to be stuck here? Because this is this sort of like, it's this shelter, it's different, it's better, but like, is this going to be my life? And so the motivation to sort of be a good kid and be who you want to be to, in order to be released for the government, to your family really seems to decrease. And so like in the case of this girl that, whose story we investigated, she really just had a breakdown. She had a pretty serious breakdown, as she just had a really hard time. She was sent to a psychiatric treatment center in Florida. And it's around that time that the family, kind of lost touch with her. That's when, and she doesn't remember all that well, because then she also was drugged. Even though her family was here, they never had a say as to whether or not, she could take those drugs. She is now totally off of those medications, but they were really heavy psychotropics. She was on about 8 to 10 different psychotropics, and she doesn't have access to them anymore. So that's the other thing too, is like we're deporting kids, and sometimes there is a certain treatment that they may have gotten, and then that supply is going to run out in a country where that mental health care is not the most pressing issue when you're not sure where you're going to sleep, for example.
So I'm just curious about a few things. One is really just how internalized racism, I guess, even if the people aren't cognizant of it, affects the treatment of these kids. Because if this was a little white blonde girl who spoke English, I doubt she would be shipped around and not listened to, and her I know we're running out of time a little bit, and her concerns not be dealt with. But then really just if you could just address that first.
Sure. I'll tell you this. Again, anecdotally, a lot of the stories that we've broken and that we've investigated, they just, it's almost a coincidence, except I think it's not, tend to be children who are Black and or Indigenous. I see it over and over and over again. Children who are not Black or Indigenous. I'm not saying all of those kids have an easy time, and I've talked to kids who have had a really, really hard time, who are not Black or Indigenous. That said, I do think, it's like such a good question, because it's something that we see over and over and over again. We know about, the way that structural violence works. And I do think that, again, regardless of the intent, it's just going to be a lot easier to sort of forget that a child who may be Black, that the child in my story that I was just talking about, she is Black, right? And I have to think that informed, even in an unconscious way, the degree to which she was helped or not. Because there were so many people that surrounded her as a person during this whole time. It takes a lot of people to keep this going. And none of those people made it so that she was ever released. She just, spent 10 to 17 in the United States, doesn't know English, doesn't know how to read or write, is figuring out how to act in her society, but it's been really tough for her.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I have a 15-year-old myself. Just that period of time is just so huge in terms of developing a broad set of skills that you need to just navigate society, frankly. All right, let's just turn for a moment to the Vice President Harris has been deployed to deal with supposedly what's happening at the border, but also on a diplomatic mission to go to some of the countries in Central America and discuss this issue. Now, part of it is going to be stricter enforcement, which of course is just absurd, because there's a reason why people are leaving these countries. Will you just speak to that? Because this is, I think, the fundamental thing that Americans don't really perceive. It's not a question, like you can try and stop people from coming, but you cannot really, I mean, you really have to address the reasons why they are leaving where they live.
Right. It doesn't really matter how high you're going to build that wall. There will always be a reason to build a ladder that's taller. I think that it's not something that I write about too often, but I think that climate is something that really needs to be taken into account here. I know that sometimes people like to, kind of isolate it country by country. This is a region, right? So Central America as a region has been hit really hard by everything from hurricanes to erosion. A lot of these places are coffee growing areas, right? And we see the way that coffee rust is affecting crops, right? And so things that people relied on, ways of living, economics that people relied on are now being threatened. And there are sometimes easier ways to make money, like sticking somebody up, right? And so when that's not available, you may see a lot more violence because that's a much easier way to just, beat someone up and get some money. And so I think that the way that climate change is tied to violence as a reason for which people come here is an important one to consider, because the countries that people are fleeing are not the countries that also have the historical emissions that have created climate change, right? We all share an atmosphere. Places like, the global north, in this case, the United States in particular, have created those historical emissions that have essentially like poked holes in the atmosphere and making things more insecure for people, not just here, but in other countries who are not responsible for the causes of climate change, right? And so I know it might sound like really disconnected, but we are really all one planet, and this really is the only planet, and we have to share it. And so I think that climate change is a big one that I hope to sort of approach more in my reporting. It's always in the back of my mind. And there's a lot of political instability. Clinton, for example, I think about Hillary Clinton in particular, and the support for a coup that happened in Honduras, right? I think about the current president of El Salvador coming to the United States, Biden not meeting with him and him meeting with Tucker Carlson, right? I mean, there's sort of a lot of moving parts, and I'm happy to learn that that Vice President Harris is going to, take a more grounded approach with these countries. Again, I think there were probably some missed opportunities along the way, but I don't think it's anything that's going to be fixed overnight at all. I just don't. I don't see that happening. They aren't problems that you can fix overnight. Climate is not a problem you can fix overnight. And I do think that a lot of these things are tied together, and I don't know that they will be addressed quickly enough to sort of stop the reasons for which people, again, come to the United States.
Aura Bogado, senior reporter, producer for Reveal News. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.